Right. Okay, so we're in Perek Memches, Pasuk. We're up to Pasuk Tes. So what I'm going to do is like this. I'm going to first give a summary, really an introduction and summary of our previous shurim, especially for those that weren't here. And because what we're going to explore this evening continues the same theme. So here's what we spoke about. You have this very interesting pasuk test, the one we're looking at now. I'm sorry, pasuk ches, where Yaakov sees the children of Yosef and says, "Who are these?" And as we explained, this pasuk needs to be explained specifically. Generally, it's a very interesting narrative that he sees them and he says, "Who are these?" And Yosef has to tell who they are. But specifically, if you focus on a detail, a lot of times you focus on a detail, it sometimes is more helpful in deciphering the meaning because you have something more specific to focus on, parenthetically. If you focus on the detail of why does this happen at this point, because as we discussed, Yaakov is on a soliloquy speaking to Yosef, and he's going on, and then he's interrupted, as it were, by noticing the Bnei Yosef, and he says, "Who's that?" And he tells him who they are. He says, "Oh, I want to bless them." So we have the whole story of that, and then it picks up again in Pasuk Chaf Aleph, Vayom Yisrael al Yosef. He continues his monologue to Yosef, but this is like an interruption when, in the middle of his speech, he notices the children and he says, "Who's this?" He wasn't done speaking to Yosef, right? Because he continues speaking to Yosef later. So then that leads to the question of, if he wasn't done speaking to Yosef, then this is an interruption. Which it sounds like interruption because he noticed something that caught his attention. He said, "Who's this?" But the question becomes, why did he notice this now? Okay, and what we did was we looked at Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes, and Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes is the key to deciphering not only this particular pasuk of Yaakov saying, "Who are these?" but it's actually key, as we'll see this evening. It's a really deep key to deciphering the inner meaning of this whole narrative, really starting from the beginning of the parasha. What it says in Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes, specifically from pasuk Yud Dalet and on, Tzion. So this is the Navi speaking in the name of Tzion. Tzion means either the land, or maybe it means the nation personified, but like not the people that constitute the nation, but rather the nation itself as an abstract concept, but personified. And Tzion says, "Hashem forgot me, abandoned me." Why does Tzion say Hashem abandoned me? Because for a long time, things were pretty desolate in the land Tzion, let's say, okay? And the response is, no, a mother can't forget her children, so Hashem won't forget you. And look, all your children are coming back. So let's start from Pasuk Yud Ches. Pick up your eyes, so we're talking to the land Tzion, probably, and we say, you think Hashem abandoned you? No way, because a mother doesn't forget her children, so Hashem won't forget you. And look, all your children are coming back to you. And the children from you whom you were bereft, Pasuk Chaf, are going to say it's crowded. It's going to happen that they're going to say it's crowded. And you're going to say to yourself, so this is Tzion, the land personified, like a woman who was bereft of her children, but a woman never forgets her children, so her children aren't going to come back to her. And she's going to say to herself, Mi yoladi es ele. So this is a rhetorical, an expression of wonder and amazement. It's not a question. It's not an interrogative. It's an exclamation. Who bore me these people? I was bereft. I was alone. I was exiled. I was wandering around. Where did these kids come from? So it's just a beautiful mashal. Think about it. Right? Eretz Yisrael is alone for 2,000 years. And thinks that Hashem forgot it. And then all of a sudden, people start coming back. And she's like, whoa, I didn't even know this. You're telling me all this time, my children were growing in number in other lands. Right? That's the next pasuk. Hashem says, no, I'm going to bring them back. And it's going to be shocking. It's going to be shocking because Tzion's going to be like, where did these kids come from? I didn't know. I didn't even know anything. I didn't know that here I was all alone, bereft. And meanwhile, it's a shock. The dissonance is a shock that at the same time that I was all alone, there was this whole thing going on without me. So this pasuk is the key to understanding Yaakov's exclamation. Yaakov was just reminiscing about the fact that he buried Rachel, baderech. He buried Rachel. He was bereft of his wife. Not only was he bereft, and he was alone. Not only was he bereft of his wife, he thought that the death of Rachel was a harbinger of the death of Yosef that he had thought occurred, and perhaps also the loss, the possible loss of Binyamin. As Chazal speak out, when Yaakov said, "Oh, you take Binyamin, I'm afraid something's going to happen to him," so the Medrash says Yaakov thought, "Kasavur," that it was Nigzer Gzeira al Rachel ubaneha sheyichlu. So the death of Rachel wasn't just a personal tragedy; it was also a foreshadowing for the tsaras that are going to happen to Yaakov, revolving around her children. And as Yaakov references in the next two psukim, he didn't expect to see Yosef. He thought that Yosef went the way of his mother Rachel to death. So Yaakov was reminiscing how there was once upon a time where he buried Rachel baderech, most lonely thing. He didn't even bring her home. He was exiled. He was wandering. He was bereft and alone. And all of a sudden, as he's reminiscing back to this state, which, like I said, it was not merely a personal state. It was also made him expect that that Yosef is going to die and Binyamin is going to die. And then next thing he knows, he's in a room with kids, with grandchildren. And mi Eila. So when Yaakov says to Yosef, mi Eila, it's not a question, not looking for information. It's an exclamation. Mi Eila. Where did these kids come from? Because these kids are exactly like the kids in the Navi over here, which is to say, Tzion is by herself, and these kids were raised in a foreign land, America, Europe, whatever, and all of a sudden they meet again, and it's a shack. So too Yaakov never met. These are the specifically, these are described as the kids that were born when Yaakov was separate from Yosef. And not only that, he expected that he's going to be alone and bereft, and all of a sudden he has this reunion. Mi'ela, where'd they come from? Okay, that's what we spoke about last week. And what I gained a deeper understanding, and we're going to see some more points in the psukim today, is that really the whole story of Yaakov vis-a-vis Ephraim and Menashe, which is that Yaakov brings them back, makes them into Shvatim, it's actually the story of Kibbutz Golios. Because we touched upon this in the past. Why is it important for Yaakov to bring Ephraim and Menashe specifically into his family? Because Ephraim and Menashe were born when Yaakov was not with Yosef. So these are the Golos children. These Ephraim and Menashe personify Bnei Yisrael not in Eretz Yisrael. So Yaakov, by bringing them back and making them like Reuben B'Shimon, he's basically affecting a kind of kibbutz golius. Exactly like Sion is saying, wait, I have children I didn't even know. So too Yaakov is doing the same thing to Ephraim and Menashe. He's making them into his children. You would think they're not his children because they weren't born under he wasn't raising them. So what he's doing over there is affecting a kind of kibbutz golius. The kids that were born outside of Eretz Yisrael, or in Yaakov's case, not just outside of Israel, but outside of his knowledge. Yaakov is like the center of the Jews, of the Jewish people. So these kids that are born outside of that circle and outside of that stage of where events are occurring in Yaakov's life, he's bringing them back into the family. So he's like affecting a kibbutz golios. This continues then from the beginning of the parasha. We spoke in the beginning of the parasha, which is about burial in Eretz Mitzrayim or burial in the land of Canaan. So the whole story, the whole tension between Yaakov and Yosef, Viyachi Yaakov be'Eretz Mitzrayim. But then when he dies, he says you have to take him back to the land of Canaan. So the whole tension, the whole sugya, the whole issue that Parashat Viyachi is revolving around so far is, do Bnei Yisrael belong in Mitzrayim or do they belong in Canaan even though they're in Mitzrayim? And Yaakov is insisting we belong in Canaan even though we're in Mitzrayim. Bury me there. Yosef agrees. And then Yaakov takes the children that are non-Canaanite children and brings them back into the family. Okay. And then we noted last week, so take a look at Pasuk Tes in Parshas Vayechi. So there was something a little bit striking about Yosef's answer. So if the question in Pasuk Ches was not really a question, but rather more like a statement of exclamation, like Mi Ele, how did these people, where did they come from? Which he really knows. But he's just saying, look, it's something incongruous over here. Here I thought I knew, Yaakov thought he knew the story of the Jewish people. He thought the story of the Jewish people was what was going on in the land of Canaan and Taraf Yosef. Turns out there was a whole nother story happening concomitantly, right? And he wasn't aware of that. So that's its exclamation. And what's Yosef's answer then? But now you see Yosef's answer fits in. We noticed something last week. So Banayim, they're my children, and God gave them to me. Well, that's interesting because Yaakov just said they're his, right? Lihaim. And here Yosef is saying Hashem gave them to me. So what's that about? The thing we focused on last week was Nasan Le'Elikim. Nasan Le'Elikim is like two psukim from now where Yaakov says, I didn't even expect to see you, and Hashem made me see your children, which is to say, there's man and what he thinks is going on, and then there's God and his deeper plan. So too, Yaakov was not aware of this because this was like a higher level plan. Okay, so that's what we most last week. But what's Yosef saying? Banai and Nasan li elikim. These are dafka, the children that Yaakov is taking for himself. But I think the answer is, what Yosef is saying is that, what's Yaakov's shak all about? Let's focus exactly what the shak is. The shak is like this. When someone thinks he understands the ways of Hashem, and then he learns that there's something that he didn't know, right? So Tzion thinks she understands the ways of Hashem. She thinks, Azavani Hashem, she thinks that what she's experiencing is the truth, the whole truth. And then she finds out that although she was abandoned by Hashem, or she wasn't really abandoned, right? Because Hashem was while she was desolate, Hashem was developing her nation in exile to bring them back to her. So she was never truly abandoned, right? But she thinks he was abandoned because she thinks that her frame of reference is the whole story. Similarly, Yaakov thought that his frame of reference, which is Taraf Yosef, a bloody cloak, the children of Rachel are dying, the next one likely to die as well. He thinks that's the story, the whole story. And now he finds out there's a whole nother story going on. So that's what Yosef is saying. What Yosef is saying is like this. At the same time that you had your story going on in Canaan, and your story is you're a Navi, you speak to Hashem, Hashem speaks to you, and so on and so forth. There was another story, a parallel story going on with me. Banai, Hashanas Anli. So Yosef is not taking them for himself. He's saying, yes, you know what? You thought the only thing that's happening was your experience with Rachel. That was your perspective. But at the same time that was happening, there was my perspective. My perspective was Hashem was giving me children bazeh here in Mitzrayim, and now when these two worlds come together, that's the shak that Yaakov undergoes. What the point that Yosef is saying is he's bringing out this point, like it says in Yeshaya, that at the same time that it may be Nezav in Tzion, there's things going on from all the nations, and Kayam Hashem, I'm going to tell them to bring them. Esel Goyim Yodi, etc. So that's what Yosef is saying. He's saying, look, you were experiencing loss while at the same time I was experiencing growth. And the growth that I was experiencing is something that Hashem was doing for your sake, and now you're going to reincorporate. So that's the point. The point is, it is in contrast to Yaakov. Why? Because Yaakov calls the children of Yosef, Hanelodim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim, meaning they were outside of my world, and therefore I want to bring them back into my world. And mi'ela means, where did it come from that something's happening that's not in the frame of reference of Yaakov, who's a Navi? Yaakov thinks he knows the ways of Hashem. All of a sudden he learned that he doesn't know the ways of Hashem, that what he saw was only a sliver of reality. So Yosef is telling him, yes, what you were experiencing is a partial reality. At the same time, there was another reality. There's a whole other story going on that was hidden from the Navi, which is Banayim Hashem Nasan Elikim Bazeh. So basically the idea is in a deeper way, and we'll see this, I hope I'm going to bring this out and I want to make this very clear. The deeper point is as follows, that what is Golus, let's say? How do we define Golus? The main definition of Golus is that the Nevi'im can no longer speak clearly about the ways of Hashem. In other words, the ways of Hashem are not clear. We don't have a relationship with Hashem. The ways of Hashem are not clear. And what's happening in this story and what's happening in Yeshaya, Perek and Tess is that what happens is that a time can come where there's very fully developed and intricate and complex stories that happened in Golus that then meet up again with Eretz Yisrael. So let's say Tzion in Yeshaya Perek Test says everything is horrible. Now it's not true. Right? Because Tzion thinks she's abandoned, but she's not really abandoned. Why is it that Tzion thinks she's abandoned and she's not really abandoned? Because the essence of Galus is that you think you're abandoned. If Tzion would know, basically, if Tzion would know for 2,000 years that her children are just taking a break and they're actually growing someplace else to come back, then that wouldn't really be Galus. That would be... That's a good question. So in Galus Bavel specifically, Yirmiyah tells them, don't listen to the Nevi'im. Hashem knows what he's thinking. Stay there. That's the parak where he tells them, Bakshu Shleim Ha'ir, build houses. In other words, if I'm understanding your question correctly, your question is why, if when we know that we're going out, it's not Galus? Yeah, okay. So, okay, that's a fair question. Okay. Yeah, to the extent that they knew it wasn't the Galus, I would say that. In other words, what I mean to say is like this. I mean to say the following. I mean to say, Eretz Yisrael is the place for Nevuah. It's the place for having Das Hashem. If that's the case, and it is, then then the essence of the key difference between having Eretz Yisrael and not having Eretz Yisrael is whether we have Nevuah, Das Hashem, or not. Which is to say, so in a sense it was, yes. And in a sense, Galus Bavel is not, in a certain sense, yes. And in that context, Yirmiyah tells them, seek this piece of the city where you are, which is to say, feel at home there. Like, you're not in Galus, like, because Hashem has plans for you. In other words, to the extent that you understand the ways of Hashem, you're not in Galus, and to the extent that you don't, you are. The irony in Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes, which is a pirush of our parak, the irony is that one person could be in Galus, but another person could be in Gilui, meaning while Yaakov is in Galus because he thinks that Hashem made him lose Yosef, from Yosef's perspective, there was a very interesting and wonderful story happening, which was that he was turning into a king and he was having children. Which is, by the way, exactly what Chazal say. A pasuk we mentioned last week, we mentioned Chazal last week, we mentioned numerous times, that another pasuk in Yeshaya, I think it's Yeshaya Perek Mem Aleph at the end of the parak, where the pasuk says, Lama Soimer Yaakov Saged Yisrael Nister Adarki Shadaber Yisrael Nister Adarki Me Hashem. Why does Yaakov say that his way is hidden from Hashem? In other words, Yaakov's, and it's a taina on Yaakov. The Medrash is very clear. It's a taina on Yaakov that Yaakov said, "Lo mahari oisoli." Why are you doing bad things to me and you're causing the master of the land to ask questions? Yaakov thought that he's abandoned by Hashem, and meanwhile, at the same time, the best things are happening to him. And that's the irony of the whole story. That there's a growth and development in Yaakov's story that he's not aware of, and because he's not aware of it, he thinks one thing, and then when he meets it, the two stories come together. The one story is, I thought I was lost you forever. That was Yaakov's experience for 22 years. And another story at the same time is, and all of a sudden Yaakov is becoming aware of that story. So this very interesting, complete story is happening at the same time that the Nevi'im are not aware of them. And and what's interesting is, we'll get back to this soon, is that the turning, the inflection point, when Yaakov becomes aware of what was happening and of Yosef's children and having children in Mitzrayim, that's the inflection point that causes the children of Yosef to be brought back into Yaakov's fold. Because the main identity of Yaakov is someone who knows the ways of Hashem. And what happened now was there were some ways of Hashem that he didn't know. He thought the ways of Hashem, he thought Hashem was hidden from Hashem because he didn't know this whole second story. Once he becomes privy to this story of Hera Osi Elokim and Gam Ezarecha, then what he's doing is he's taking the Yosef story, which was a story of Galus, a story of separating from of Yaakov, right? And he's bringing it back in, and therefore the children of Yosef become his children.
Is it because he lost his nevuah during those 22 years?
Yeah, exactly. Had he not lost his nevuah, then we wouldn't have had this pasuk, right? It would have been like, okay, this is happening there, but at the same time, it would be a whole different story, right? The whole story is that, okay, there's two things happening. There's two frames. The only reason there's two frames is because he lost his nevuah. So this is about how Nevi'im could lose their nevuah, Klal Yisrael could lose their understanding of what's going on with them, which is about Toimat Tzion Azavani Hashem, and then the redemption happens when they come back around and they start understanding things that for a long time they didn't understand. And we mentioned last week, I'm just going to mention this briefly because it's not really relevant, just it's so interesting, is that There, the message to Tzion is a mother doesn't forget her children. So here too, Yaakov was reminiscing and he was remembering burying Rachel, and that made him think, oh, it was so lonely, and I'm never going to see her again, or her children I thought I wouldn't see again. But really, it's Rachel, the mother, her love is eternal, and she's the one who makes sure that the children come back, as Chazal say. So it's the very thing that made Yaakov feel so lonely, which is missing Rachel, who was so dedicated to all she ever wanted was children, she had the greatest love for her children. That's actually the guarantee that he could not be forgotten. So it's very interesting that Yaakov's thought that Hashem abandoned him is when Rachel died, is actually him not understanding the power of the mother of Rachel, who will guarantee that her children will always come back. Some interesting irony there. Okay, now let's learn Pasuk Tes, and at some point we're going to go back to Yeshaya Perek Tes and see some more parallels and depth there. Okay, so Yaakov said to Yosef, bring them to me so that I can bless them. Now, what you might expect to follow immediately on Yaakov's request to Yosef to bring them to him so that he might bless them is what happens in Pasuk Yud Gimel. Vayikach Yosef es shneim vayigesh elav. So Yaakov said, bring them to me, take them. He said Lashon Kicha. And Yosef did in fact take them and bring them to him, but that happened only after a break of 3 psukim. So we have to understand how to read that. In other words, what happened in between? If Yaakov said to Yosef, bring them to me so I may bless them, you would expect the next thing to happen would be that Yosef would take them and bless them. But no, something happens in between. So let's try to read that and see how the psukim explain themselves why, although Yaakov said to Yosef, bring them to me so that I may bless them, that didn't happen immediately. He couldn't see. So you can't just bring them and stand them in front of Yaakov, because he first wants to identify them. He wants to know who's who. And he can't see. So in other words, I think this pasuk is saying, if Yaakov could see, then as soon as he would have told Yosef, bring them to me so I may bless them, so Yosef would say, okay, here's Ephraim, here's Menashe, give them bracha. But no, he can't see them. So he can't just put them standing in front of him. Instead, vayagesh oisam elov. He has to bring them close to him. Vayishak lehem vaychabek lehem. He has to be tactile. He has to feel them. And of course, this reminds us of Yitzchak. Couldn't see, but in order to determine who to bless, he has to feel them. So similarly, Yaakov now knew who's who because he felt them. But then we expect him to do it right, but now he's going to do it wrong, right? That whole theme of the younger getting over the older happening again. But this is picking up on the Yitzchak feeling who's the older and who's the younger, and determining on that basis who should get the blessing. By the way, Vayagesh, I saw someone says, I think it was Vizel, who says, I think correctly, Vayagesh is Yaakov. And he bases it on the trop, because how do you read the pasuk Pashup Pshat? I always thought, since Yisrael couldn't see, so Yosef brought his sons close to him, and Yaakov kissed them and hugged them. But he says, but then the asnachta should be on Elov, because if it's like this, since he couldn't see, therefore Yosef brought them close, and Yaakov hugged them and kissed them. So the main break would be after the word he brought them close. But since it says, and he brought them close and kissed them and hugged them, that tells him that it's all referring to Yaakov, according to the Trump, which I think is correct. Yaakov, brought them, Ephraim and Menashe, close to himself, and he kissed them. So just who's doing the Vayagesh? In other words, he couldn't see, so he didn't wait for Yosef to just set them up. He said, he sees his way. He reached for them and said, come here, I want to feel you. Okay. Now, after he felt them, and he was so happy with them, and he hugged them and kissed them, Vayomer Yisrael and Yosef, Roifonecha lo filolti, v'hinei haraosi elhim gam esarecha. Okay, so this is about, I didn't think I could see something, and all of a sudden I'm able to see. Something hidden became revealed. We mentioned before, the pasuk, it's worth looking up the pasuk inside, in Yeshaya Perek, the end of Perek, maybe it's end of Perek Mem. Yes, it's end of Perek Mem. Pasuk Chav Zayin. Lama Somer Yaakov Usedaber Yisrael Nistar Daki Hashem. Why should you say that? Why are you saying that? Why does Yaakov think that it's way hidden from Hashem? This is a taina on Yaakov. I'm very happy we looked this up because. Well, let me just finish the thought, and then I'll show you what's so interesting about it. That's good. We looked it up. The Bereshis Rabbazi Dash brings us on this pasuk. Is the exact same thing he's saying in the pasuk? Why? Why didn't he think he's ever going to see Yosef? Because he thought Nistar Dakim Hashem. It didn't occur to him that Hashem has deeper plans than man's, and maybe Yosef is missing for some crazy reason, like Hashem wants him to be sold into Mitzrayim and interpret dreams. It never occurred to him, such a wild story. He said Tov Yosef because he thought Nistar Dakim Hashem. He concluded that Hashem forgot about him, like what Termitzian is about Hashem. And I'm bringing this pasuk because the Yaakov said, "I didn't expect to see you, and now I got to see." It's all about Hester, right? He thought things were hidden, and he thought he was hidden from Hashem, which is to say, he didn't see how Hashem is operating in his life, and now he gets to see the revelation of Hashem. Now, sight is so important. Look at the pasuk before. This is why I'm happy I looked it up. I didn't realize this. So look in Yeshaya Perek Mem pasuk Chavav. Look up to the heavens, see who created the stars. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into this, but we looked at this pasuk numerous times. Bnei Yisrael being like stars, and the Bnei Yisrael coming to Mitzrayim and being counted when they come down to Mitzrayim. I think we spoke about this pasuk in that context. So we had in the Perek Memtes, we were looking at pick up your eyes and see all your children coming, right? All your children coming is Bnei Yisrael. They're going to come back to Eretz Yisrael. So to Yaakov, who thought he was abandoned, eventually they're all counted. They're all together. All 70 of them get reunited. And that's when Yaakov realizes, whoops, Hashem did not forget about me. I should never have said, Nistar Daki Me Hashem. When he picks up his eyes, right? And picking up his eyes is so important because he couldn't see, and yet he's seeing, as we discussed. On one hand, the pasuk says he's blind, he can't see. On the other hand, the pasuk talks about Vayar Yisrael es b'nei Yosef and Hera oisi elikim gam azarecha. So many Mepharshim say, that's the point. He couldn't see naturally, but he was granted a supernatural sight, and that's what's the lesson of pick up your eyes and see the ways of Hashem. Okay, now let's go back to Perek Memtes. And I want to show you one other important thing in Perek Memtes. Let's read Pasuk Chav Beis in Perek Memtes in Yeshaya. Koyomar Hashem Elikim Hine Esel Goyim Yodi Velarim Arim Nisi. So Hashem is going to call out to the nations and Amim and will lift his flag. Ve'yiviu v'nayich b'choitz, and they're going to bring back your sons and daughters. V'hayu malachim oimenayich v'sorisei menikoisayich. Kings will be those that raise your children, and Saras will be the nursemaids. Apayim eretz yishtachavulach. They're going to bow down to the ground on their faces. V'afar raglai they're going to lick the dust of your feet. V'yodat ki ani Hashem asher lo yavoshu koivai. You're going to know that I am Hashem, who those that hope for are not ashamed. Okay, so Tzion thinks that she's abandoned. Eventually, when her children come back, she's going to know that Ani Hashem, and those who hope for me are not embarrassed. Yaakov was always struggle always revolved around Ani Hashem. Why? Because the beginning of Parashat Vayetze, Hashem said to Yaakov, Ani Hashem Elokei Avraham Avicha, and Lo E'ezavcha, I'm not going to abandon you. Hashem said to Yaakov, he's not going to abandon him. But Yaakov was always afraid that Hashem would abandon him. We see in the beginning of Parashat Vayishlach. He was afraid that Esav is going to kill him. Chazal talk about that. Why was he afraid? Hashem promised him. Okay, but he was afraid. And he also thought that Hashem abandoned him in the story of Yosef. He said, Nistar Daki Me Hashem. So why is that? I Hashem told him, Ani Hashem lo yazavcha. The answer is, Ani Hashem. If you live up to Ani Hashem, then lo yazavcha. But you have to live up to it. So Yaakov, when does Yaakov finally realize that Ani Hashem asher lo yevoishu koivai. You were not abandoned. Now, when he's finally reunited, not only does he see Yosef, but he even has the blessing of seeing his grandchildren. Now he knows Ani Hashem asher lo yevoishu koivai. Hashem told him in the beginning of Pashas Vayetze, Ani Hashem lo ye'ezavecha. And I thought Vatoy Matzin as Avani Hashem, because I thought I was abandoned and Yosef was lost. Now I finally learn Ani Hashem, and those that hope for me have no reason to be ashamed, have no reason for shame. And look about the Lo Yevoshu. I want you to look at Perek Chav Tes in Yeshaya. Perek Chav Tes Pasuk Chav Beis. We mentioned this last week as well, but it's kedai just to pull it all together. Perek Chav Tes in Yeshaya Pasuk Chav Beis. Lochein koyomar Hashem al Beis Yaakov. A message to the house of Yaakov. Loi ato yevosh Yaakov. Loi ato panav Yechavaru. Yaakov has no need to be ashamed or his face to turn white. Ki. When he sees his children, that's when he has no longer being ashamed. So Yaakov is missing his children. And not only do I get to see you, but instead I realize that by having missed you, you developed this whole thing going on in Mitzrayim and Ephraim and Menashe, an amazing family. Now Yaakov is no longer embarrassed, and now he understands Ani Hashem, Asher lo yevoishu koivoi. Okay, to pull it even further together, at the end of Perek Mem it says, why does Yaakov say, Nistor Darkei Hashem, Koivei Hashem yachalifu choyach? If you hope for Hashem, everything will be great. So Yaakov didn't realize that, and finally he learns that when he's reunited with Yosef and with his children. Let's go right to Perek Mem Ches. Let's read the next pasuk. Pasuk Yud Beis. Vayoytze Yosef Osam Me'im Birkov. Now, interesting move. Yosef takes his children out from Yaakov's knees. So they're like on Yaakov's lap, or he's hugging them closely, and Yosef's like, okay, enough. Takes them away. Va yishtachu la'apav arza, and Yosef bows to his face on the ground. Now the question is, why did Yosef do this? What's the significance of this? So I think the pshat is pashut. Because Yosef in the next pasuk is going to set them up in the right spots. So he's going to make sure that the Bechor is on the right side, and Menashe is on the right side, Ephraim on the left side. If they're on Yaakov's lap, they might not be arranged in the right place. So Yosef's like, okay, we're good. You hug them. Now let's set them up for the bracha. So the pasuk makes the point. Yosef took them, was like, okay, everyone has to get into the right spots, and that increases the irony that then Yaakov goes like that. Okay. It wasn't Ben Mikra. Yosef was very careful to make sure they're set up properly. He takes them and says, okay, now you're going to stand here, you're going to stand there, and it doesn't work out. Fine. Right? Good? Why does he bow now, all of a sudden now? So I think Pshat is, and I think Rashi says this, because now that he came close to his father, so in a way of respect, he's walking back from his father, or because he just came close, he bows to his face. I think that's what Rashi says, which is fine, good. Mm-hmm. Very good. Excellent. So originally he wasn't approaching. Very good. Till now everything was Yaakov. Now that Yosef approached him, he gave him this great respect of bowing, not stam bowing onto his face on the earth. Okay, I guess, do we learn from here this is what you're supposed to do to your father? How come we don't learn from this pasuk that we don't, by the way, we don't find it by Yaakov and Yitzchak. He walked in and he bowed to his face. Interesting. It's very interesting, this whole Vaishtachal Apavartza, but I want to show you how now what the oimik is.
That they were already backwards, and Yosef takes them. He's like, ta.
Yeah. So therefore, what? So therefore, he has to bow.
He's trying to ingratiate him.
Right, because here he just was like, okay, guys, okay, enough. Why is he doing that though? Why is he? Yeah, it does a little bit sound like that. But Yaakov
did about delaying the whole story that I didn't bury your mother did
right.
For other purposes, and you had this whole background.
Right.
Yeah,
maybe, yeah. Maybe. So now let's go back to Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes, and you'll see an amazing thing that will give us an oimik over here. I think there's still some questions about the bowing, but we'll see at least what Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes, how it interpreted the significance of this bowing. Let's read those psukim again. Pasuk of Beis. Hashem says, I'm going to bring back your children from among the nations, your sons and daughters, right? Now you have a lot of sons and daughters. Who's going to take care of them? Kings are going to be your babysitters. V'soreseim menikosayich. Apayim eretz yishtachavu loch. They're going to bow to you down on their face to the ground. V'afar raglaich elachechu. So in Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes, which talks about Kibbutz Golios, the ingathering of the exiles, and Yeshaya Perek Mem Tes develops this whole theme on the basis of Bereshis Perek Mem Ches, and uses this idea of where do these kids come from, and pick up your eyes and see. It also has kings bowing down to the Eretz, and has these same three words: Apayim Eretz Yishtachavu. Yosef is a king. Recall that not so long ago, Yaakov bowed to him because he was a king. And now all of a sudden there's a king bowing on his apayim, on the aretz, to Yaakov as if to lick the dust of his feet. So what's going on over here? What's going on over here? So let's think about it in the context of that chapter, and then we'll see what it means in our chapter. In the context of that chapter, as we said, there's a very interesting irony going on. Sion thinks she's abandoned. But really, during all those years that she was abandoned, her children were developing in other lands. Now, when they come back to her, she's like, wow, I can't believe this. I had no idea that while I was feeling one way, Hashem was also had all sorts of plans for me, right? And now when these two stories converge, Tzion realizes that the story that was happening in Golos was really all so that they should come back to Eretz Yisrael. Because the story becomes once again a story of Eretz Yisrael, a story of Das Hashem, a story of Nevuah. So the kings, who are the powers to be outside of Tzion, realize that whatever connection they have to Bnei Yisrael was really all on behalf of Tzion. They thought that they controlled Bnei Yisrael for their own good. And they thought Tzion was abandoned, like Tzion thought. Now that Tzion learns that what was happening in exile was there in order for them to come back to you, so the kings, the ones who originally thought they controlled the Jews didn't control them, but they thought it was for them selfish purposes, now realize that they're there to serve Tzion, and that's what they're going to do. So now you plug that into our story, it's exact same thing. Yosef is the king, yes, but he's the king in Golos, right? He's the king in Mitzrayim. And Yaakov stands for Tzion. Yaakov is the one who says, take me back to Canaan. He's the Navi. He only lived in Mitzrayim, Bakarcha, all that. So the fact that Yosef, the king, is bowing to Yaakov at this point in the story is because this is the inflection point. When Yaakov says to Yosef, I didn't expect to see you, and now Hashem makes me see your children, what he's saying is your whole story, your whole cute little thing that you had going on in Mitzrayim was really all so that it should be really part of my story. There was a long time I wasn't aware of it, but now Hashem showed it to me because really it's my story. You think it's your story, it's really my story. Your children are mine. And what are you then? You're a king, very nice you're a king, but you're a babysitter. Isn't a beautiful irony there? Because Yosef, if Yosef's children, Ephraim and Menashe, are really Yaakov's children, so what's Yosef doing, taking care of them for all these years? There it is, you're just doing it for your surrogate dad. You're an Ayman. So the significance, the meaning of the king being the Ayman is that the king realizes, what's an Ayman? An Ayman is someone who does, everything he does is not for himself, right? A regular father takes care of his kids. Is it selfish or selfless? It's both. He's taking care of them, but he gets something from it. An Ayman is just doing it for someone else. So the kings realize that, okay, everything he did with Bnei Yisrael was really for Tzion. Yosef realizes that everything he had going on with time was really to bring it back to Yaakov, and it's given the sharpest expression in the fact that Yosef's very children, his own children, were adopted by his father and taken, as it were, away from him to go back to his father, to go back to Tzion, to be part of his father's family. And Yosef was demoted, as it were, to the role of a melech who's just an oimein. Okay? So that's what I was saying. Now this is why I was started saying before, and I want to bring this out better, that our parak is about Kibbutz Golios. That's what I've understood much better, that the whole idea of Viחi is Kibbutz Golios. And Kibbutz Golios meaning when the story of Golos becomes understood as being part of the story of Tzion, that is Kibbutz Golios, because that's when the people in Golos know what they could contribute to Tzion. They realize that their story is part of the story of Tzion. And that's why the symbol of that is Ephraim and Menashe becoming the children of Yaakov. It's the most beautiful symbol, because here are the people that were Golos people, and yet they're brought back into the story of Yaakov. And when they're brought back into the story of Yaakov, the greatest powers, even the kings of exile, recognize that they're part of Yaakov's story. So Yosef bows down to Yaakov. And that's when Yaakov realizes, Ani Hashem, right? V'yodat ki ani Hashem asher lo yivoshu koivai. Now is when Yaakov knows that Ani Hashem. When Yosef bows to him, that's when he knows. Why? Because Yosef bowing to him means you thought Yosef was lost, you thought Yosef was missing. Nistar Dakim Hashem, really everything that Yosef was doing, becoming a king, was all there to serve you, so that he can produce an Ephraim and Menashe that can then become back to you. So that's when he realizes, you know what? The whole thing that I thought was abandoned was really just a mirage. Really, there was so much happening that was going to come back and become part of my story.
I guess he was even wrong when Yosef was around, before he was sold.
Wrong for what?
Because he thought Yosef's the promised child and everything, it turns out he's just a glorified babysitter.
Well, yeah, right. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's very interesting because, look, Yosef became the glorified babysitter only because Yaakov thought he was a promised child, right? In other words, that Yosef became the king of Mitzrayim because he believed in himself and Yaakov believed in him. You know what I'm saying? It's very important. In other words, you were saying before like this. You asked the question before. What if Yaakov would have known the whole time Yosef's there, right? Then Yosef would never become Yosef because then he would always know that he's just a pawn. He can't realize that he's a pawn. You know what I'm saying? The king, let's say the king over here, that's your babysitter, right? The only reason it's cool that the king is a babysitter is because he thought he was a king. Right. If he would have always, exactly, if he would have known that he's a babysitter for 2,000 years, he would never be a king and it wouldn't even be so cool. So you need this tension of, on the one hand, he developed his own little thing and it was like really cool and he thought it was king of the world. Taka was king of the world for a little time. And then in hindsight, he's like, oh, this is all babysitting. That's the cool thing. So that's why the Gullus and the Gula have to have this tension, right? You have to have a little Hester. It wouldn't be so interesting if not for the Hester. That's the beauty. The Hester, the pattern of the rhythm of concealment and then revelation allows for interesting things to happen, such as kings being a babysitter. They wouldn't be kings if there wasn't concealment, right?